Advanced AWS Interview Questions 1. Disaster Recovery and High Availability Scenario. You're tasked with designing a highly available e-commerce application on AWS. The application needs to handle high traffic during peak times and ensure minimal downtime. The customer database is relational, and the application serves both dynamic and static content. Questions. How would you architect this application using AWS services to ensure high availability and scalability? How would you ensure that the relational database can scale to handle the traffic spikes? What services or configurations would you use to ensure the static content is efficiently delivered across the globe? How would you implement disaster recovery with an RTO, recovery time objective, of 5 minutes and an RPO, recovery point objective, of 1 hour? Second, VPC design and security scenario. Your company is moving to AWS and you need to design a virtual private cloud VPC setup that meets strict security compliance. The application needs to communicate securely with on-premises data centers, and some services need to be publicly accessible. Questions. How would you design the VPC with both public and private subnets? How would you ensure secure communication between the AWS VPC and on-premises data centers? What security mechanisms would you use to protect the public-facing services from malicious attacks? How would you handle logging and monitoring for security incidents in this architecture? 3. Cost optimization scenario. You have been asked to review the architecture of a startup's AWS environment. The startup is growing rapidly and is concerned about increasing AWS costs. Their application uses EC2 instances, RDS, and S3 extensively. Questions. How would you identify potential cost-saving opportunities in this architecture? Which AWS services or features would you recommend to optimize compute and storage costs? How would you use auto-scaling and EC2 spot instances to reduce costs while maintaining performance? What tools would you use to track and monitor costs continuously in the AWS environment? Fourth, migration to AWS scenario. A company wants to migrate its on-premises web application to AWS. The application is a monolithic architecture running on a single server and uses a MySQL database. They need a plan that includes minimal downtime during migration. Questions. How would you approach the migration of this application to AWS? What AWS services would you use to host the application and database in the cloud? How would you minimize downtime during the migration? Once the application is migrated, how would you ensure it can scale and remain highly available? 5. Serverless application scenario. Your company wants to move away from managing EC2 instances and is considering using a serverless architecture for their new application. The application will have unpredictable traffic with large spikes during specific times of the year. Questions. How would you design this application using serverless services in AWS? What advantages does AWS Lambda offer compared to running the application on EC2 instances? How would you handle the storage and processing of large amounts of data within this serverless application? How would you ensure the serverless architecture scales automatically with demand and remains cost-efficient? 6. Data storage and backup scenario. A healthcare company needs to store sensitive patient records in AWS. These records must be stored securely for 7 years and backups must be made daily. Compliance with strict security and privacy regulations, for example, HIPAA, is required. Questions. Which AWS services would you use to store and back up these records securely? How would you ensure compliance with security regulations, for example, encryption, audit logs, access controls? How would you automate daily backups, and what backup strategy would you recommend to ensure data availability for 7 years? What steps would you take to protect data from accidental deletion or corruption? 7. Auto-scaling and load balancing scenario. You manage an application that experiences varying traffic patterns. During peak hours, the application becomes slow and users experience high latency. The application runs on a fleet of EC2 instances. Questions. How would you implement auto-scaling to handle traffic spikes automatically? How would you set up an elastic load balancer, ELB, to distribute traffic evenly across the EC2 instances? How would you configure auto-scaling policies to scale out and scale in based on traffic demand? What monitoring tools would you use to ensure that the application's performance is stable? 8. Data analytics. Scenario. Your company collects millions of data points from IoT devices daily. You need to build a data analytics pipeline to store, process, and analyze the data in near real time. Questions. How would you design a scalable data ingestion pipeline for this data? What AWS services would you use to store and process this large volume of data efficiently? How would you implement near real-time data analytics on the collected data? How would you ensure the pipeline can handle both current data volumes and potential future growth? 9. CI/CD pipeline scenario. Your development team wants to implement a CI/CD pipeline in AWS to automate code deployments. They use Git for version control and need the pipeline to automatically deploy changes to production after successful tests. Questions. How would you design the CI/CD pipeline using AWS services? What tools or services would you use to automate testing and deployments? How would you handle rolling back deployments in case of failure? How would you secure the pipeline and ensure only approved changes are deployed? 10. Monitoring and alerts. Scenario. An e-commerce application is hosted in AWS and the business requires continuous uptime. You need to ensure that any issues, for example, high CPU usage, instance failures, are detected and resolved quickly. Questions. What AWS tools would you use to monitor the health and performance of the application? How would you configure alarms and notifications for critical events, for example, high CPU, disk space issues, service outages? How would you ensure logs are captured for troubleshooting purposes? How would you create a process to automatically recover from certain failures, such as instance crashes? 11. Hybrid cloud architecture scenario. A large enterprise runs critical applications both on-premises and in AWS. They want to implement a hybrid cloud architecture that ensures seamless communication between the two environments. Questions. How would you design a hybrid architecture that integrates the on-premises environment with AWS? What services would you use to establish secure connectivity between AWS and the on-premises infrastructure? How would you ensure data consistency and security across the two environments? How would you handle scenarios where workloads need to be moved from on-premises to AWS?